In a frozen corner of the wilderness, where survival seemed impossible, one widow's ingenuity became the difference between life and death. While others succumbed to starvation in the spring, her brine barrel held the secret to preserving what most thought would rot. But how did she discover this life-saving method in a world on the brink of collapse? Before we dive into the heart of this incredible tale, let us know where you're watching from. If stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more extraordinary than this one. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when Eliza stepped out into the biting cold, the sky still painted in shades of deep purple and pink. The landscape around her was a harsh, frozen reminder of the world she had come to know. The first frost had descended, covering everything in a layer of glittering ice, and with it, the harsh reality of frontier life settled in. Eliza was no stranger to hardship. Widowhood had come early, leaving her to raise two young children in a small, isolated cabin tucked away in the rugged mountains. Her husband had died the previous winter, leaving her with no choice but to continue the struggle alone. Survival in these unforgiving conditions demanded more than just strength. It required resourcefulness, the kind of ingenuity that came from deep within when faced with insurmountable odds. As she approached the wooden barrel outside her cabin, the faint scent of brine rose to meet her. It was a familiar smell, but today it carried more weight than usual. The salt water was beginning to freeze, a sign that the temperature had dropped well below what even the hardiest of settlers could endure. The pork she had salted in the barrel the previous fall was all that remained of their stored food. Most of the crops had failed, and game had become scarce. Winter had arrived early, and the prospects for the coming months were grim. But Eliza had an idea. It was a strange one she hadn't dared to share with anyone. The neighbors, when they still came through the pass on their way to the nearest town, had always laughed at her methods, calling them too old-fashioned. They had their own ways, methods learned from their ancestors who had survived by hunting and foraging. But Eliza knew something they didn't. She had learned from her mother's recipes and practices the forgotten art of preserving food in ways that others had abandoned. Taking a deep breath, Eliza lifted the lantern from the nearby post and made her way to the barrel. The pork, salted and submerged in brine, still looked fresh, even though the bitter cold had set in. She knew that this simple method would outlast the freeze and provide the nourishment her children needed to survive the long months ahead. Others might starve, but not them. Not while she still had the strength to fight for it. The days that followed were a blur of hard work and cold winds. Each morning Eliza awoke to a landscape that had grown increasingly inhospitable. Snowstorms had begun to batter the cabin, and the temperatures plummeted well below freezing, forcing Eliza to spend more time inside than she ever had before. The fire in the hearth was always stoked high, filling the cabin with warmth, but the air outside seemed determined to seep into every crack and crevice. Her children, though used to the hardships of the frontier, began to show signs of the wear that came with months of deprivation. Their faces were gaunt, their stomachs empty despite the meager meals Eliza prepared. The brine barrel had become a crucial lifeline, but it wasn't enough. The meat, though preserved, was slowly being consumed, and without new provisions they would soon run out of everything. Eliza knew that she had to act fast. Her thoughts turned to the wild game that roamed the forests surrounding the cabin. The hunting traps she'd set out over the past few days had not yielded much. The animals had become skittish, hiding in the deeper parts of the woods where the cold was even harsher and the winds more relentless. Still, she couldn't give up. She couldn't risk her children's lives. It was on one such morning, when the frost still lingered in the air and the ground was hard with ice, that Eliza ventured into the forest once again. With only her rifle and a few dried herbs for company, she trekked through the snow-covered woods, the weight of her task settling heavily on her shoulders. The brine barrel might have kept the pork fresh, but it wouldn't sustain them much longer. She needed to find food, not just for a day, but for the weeks ahead. As she walked deeper into the wilderness, the biting cold began to gnaw at her skin, seeping through her thick woolen shawl. She had always prided herself on being resourceful, but today something felt different. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and small animals muffled by the heavy snow. Eliza pushed on, each step a reminder of the danger that lay ahead. She knew there was no turning back now. The world outside her cabin might be unforgiving, but she had a responsibility to her family, and she would do whatever it took to keep them alive. It wasn't long before a rustle in the bushes caught her attention. A deer, skittish and thin, emerged from the trees, its coat matted with snow. It was an opportunity too good to pass up. Eliza took aim, her heart pounding in her chest. The rifle kicked in her hands as she fired, and the deer crumpled to the ground. Eliza stood for a moment staring at her kill, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had succeeded, but the victory was short-lived. With the deer in hand, she turned toward home, her thoughts consumed by the challenges that still lay ahead. Would the brine barrel truly hold the key to survival? Only time would tell. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warm glow contrasting the icy expanse outside. Eliza sat at the small wooden table, the scent of roasting deer filling the cabin, a rare comfort in an otherwise harsh season. Her children huddled close to the fire, their thin frames drawn together for warmth. They had seen better days, and Eliza could feel the weight of each passing hour, each moment where the future seemed uncertain. The deer she had hunted earlier that day had provided a welcome reprieve. The meat was lean but hearty, enough to fill their bellies for a while. She had taken the time to carefully process every part of the animal, stretching it into as many meals as she could. Her hands, now stained with blood and dirt, worked swiftly. There was no time for wasted motion. Every resource she could salvage would be vital to their survival. Her mind wandered back to the brine barrel, sitting in the corner of the cabin, filled with pork she had salted earlier in the season. It had been the first real step toward preparing for the winter, an instinctual decision, one that had come from years of watching her mother preserve food in this very way. Yet, as Eliza stared at the food drying on the rack, the realization hit her that this method could be the difference between life and death. The pork would last, perhaps longer than she even expected. It was a method, strange to others, but one that had kept food from spoiling during the harshest winters. Her mind began to race, wondering if she could push this preservation method further, perhaps with the deer she had just hunted. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of her youngest son, Thomas. He looked up at her with eyes filled with concern, his small face pale from the cold. "Mama, is the snow going to last much longer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza smiled softly, brushing the loose strands of hair from his forehead. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll be all right. We always make it through, don't we?" Thomas nodded, but Eliza could see the fear in his eyes. He was too young to understand fully, but he knew the weight of the cold and the hunger that had begun to gnaw at them all. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, bending the snow-covered branches and making the roof creak. It was the first sign of a storm coming, and Eliza knew that once the storm arrived, the hunting would become even more difficult. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not for a second. Every day spent in this wilderness brought new challenges, and the brine barrel, with its salted pork and future potential, was now central to her survival plan. As night fell and the storm began to pick up, Eliza finished preparing their meal. She knew it wouldn't be enough to last much longer, but it would have to suffice for now. Tomorrow she would go back into the woods and hunt once again. The deer was a good start, but she couldn't rely on luck alone. She would have to get creative, just like she did with the brine barrel. Days passed in a blur of snowstorms, hunger, and hard labor. The once soft glow of the fire now seemed dimmer, as though even it, in its age, had grown tired of fighting against the cold. Eliza's hands were raw from the constant work. tending the fire, keeping the cabin warm, and preparing whatever little food she could get her hands on. Each meal she made felt like a fleeting victory, and the uncertainty of the next day loomed over her like a constant, oppressive shadow. The brine barrel, still in the corner of the cabin, had become her obsession. Every time she walked past it, she found herself inspecting the contents, lifting the cloth, checking the salt levels, and praying the pork would stay preserved long enough to carry them through the winter. The idea of running out of food, of losing her only real chance at survival, was almost too much to bear. Her thoughts turned to the wild game she had been hunting. The deer had been a blessing, but it wasn't enough to rely on. She had set traps for rabbits, squirrels, and whatever else she could catch, but each morning had come with disappointment. The traps were either empty or triggered by something she couldn't even find. The animals had become skittish, no doubt sensing the same desperation she felt. And even if she managed to catch something, how long could she preserve it? The brine barrel was not infinite, and each piece of game she caught was a fleeting resource. Eliza's eyes wandered to the jars of preserved vegetables and berries that lined the shelves above her work table. They, too, were dwindling. She had worked tirelessly to preserve what little she could from the last harvest, but without the ability to gather more, she knew the jars would soon run out. The winter had taken its toll on her, and with each passing day, her strength felt more and more like a fragile thing. The storm outside grew fiercer as the days stretched on. Eliza had stopped trying to predict when it would end. She simply waited, patiently, desperately, knowing that the next few weeks would be make or break. It was a dangerous kind of waiting, the kind that slowly eroded her resolve, testing her every step. She found herself drifting between moments of quiet panic and the routine of survival, constantly reminding herself that she couldn't afford to succumb to fear. But it was the nights that were hardest. As the cold wind howled outside, she would lie awake, listening to her children sleep, wondering how much longer they could hold on. The brine barrel, her greatest hope, seemed to mock her, its contents both a comfort and a constant reminder of what was at stake. Could she keep them alive long enough to see the thaw? Could she make it through the cold season without losing everything she had fought for? Only time would tell. The morning light crept through the cracks in the cabin's walls, pale and weak, as though even the sun was hesitant to brave the bitter cold. Eliza had woken early, the fire already crackling in the hearth. The stove was her only ally. These days keeping the chill at bay, but it wasn't enough to drive away the gnawing worry that sat heavy in her chest. The days had grown longer, the storm more relentless. Yet she could not afford to stop, not when every action she took mattered so much. Her children were still asleep, bundled under the thick quilts she had sewn during quieter months, but Eliza knew their sleep was fragile. The quiet moments were slipping away as hunger took hold of her family's nerves, gnawing at them all. She had no way of knowing when the storm would break. The storm had already claimed 2 weeks, and the remaining game around their home was either buried under snow or hidden deep in the thick woods. Her eyes moved to the brine barrel in the corner, its contents still sealed tight beneath its cloth cover. She had been diligent in checking it daily. The pork she had salted seemed as though it would hold for a while longer, but Eliza couldn't help but feel the ever-present fear that soon it might not be enough. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door broke her thoughts. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle hanging by the hearth, and her pulse quickened. No one had passed through this far out in weeks. It could be a trapper, or worse, a bear, testing the walls again. Her breath caught in her throat as the knock came again, followed by a voice she didn't recognize. "Is anyone home? I'm in need of shelter from the storm." Eliza's mind raced. Her heart hammered as she carefully placed the rifle back on its hook, cautiously moving toward the door. She couldn't afford to turn away someone in need, but the wilderness was unpredictable, and trust was a luxury she could not afford. She opened the door just a crack, her lantern's warm glow spilling out onto the snow. Standing there in the cold wind was a man, lean, haggard, and dressed in tattered furs that looked like they had seen better days. "I'm sorry to trouble you," the man said with a strained voice, "but the storm's worse than I expected, and I've lost my way. Please, just for a night." Eliza hesitated, her gaze scanning his face. His eyes were tired, but not unkind. He wasn't a threat, at least not yet. There was something familiar about him, something she couldn't quite place. "I have children inside," Eliza said cautiously, her voice low, "and supplies are scarce. I can't promise much, but you're welcome to stay the night. Just the night." The man nodded gratefully, stepping inside as she held the door open. The wind howled behind him, and Eliza felt a sense of unease settle in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just the storm outside she had to worry about, it was the secrets the wilderness could hold. As the stranger stepped inside, the warmth from the fire washed over him, his body visibly relaxing as he shrugged off his heavy coat. Eliza closed the door behind him, locking it securely. She eyed the man warily, still unsure what had driven him this far into the wilderness, especially during such a storm. "You're welcome to sit by the fire," she said, her voice softer now. "I'll get you something to eat." The man nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The cabin was small but well kept. The fire burned brightly, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Eliza noticed the way he hesitated near the brine barrel, his gaze lingering on it for just a moment before he looked away. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, settling onto a small stool beside the fire. "I haven't seen many cabins like this out here. You've built yourself a fine place." Eliza didn't respond right away. The compliments were typical for newcomers, but they felt hollow to her. All the cabin really was, in her mind, was a fragile shelter against the elements, a place where she and her children could survive another day. Nothing more. She gathered the remaining meat from the deer she had killed, frying it quickly in the pan. The meat was thin, but it would be enough for a modest meal. The man watched her, his gaze thoughtful but quiet. It was clear he had his own burdens, his own struggles to hide. He seemed as though he was trying to keep his secrets close. "You've been traveling long?" Eliza asked as she placed the plate of food on the table, sitting down across from him. "What brings you out this far?" The man paused, his hand stilling over the fork. He met her eyes for the first time, his face hardening ever so slightly. "A man's got his reasons for being out here," he replied, his voice distant. "But sometimes the land gives you more than you bargained for." Eliza didn't press him further, sensing that he wasn't ready to reveal much, but there was something in the way he spoke that unsettled her. It was as though his past was heavier than the cold that surrounded them, and the storm outside was only a small part of the weight he carried. As they ate in silence, Eliza's mind wandered back to the brine barrel. Her strange method of preserving food had never seemed as important as it did now. It wasn't just food, it was life. She'd held on to that method for months, uncertain whether it would really save them. But in a world as unforgiving as this, every choice felt critical. She knew deep down that her strange preservation method was a lifeline that might keep them alive long after everyone else had exhausted their resources. The storm raged outside, the wind howling as it rattled the walls of the cabin. Inside, however, there was an uneasy quiet. The man finished his meal, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Thank you," he said. "I won't stay long. Just needed a place to wait out the storm. Then I'll be on my way." Eliza watched him closely. He hadn't asked for much, and he didn't seem to want much either, but his words hung in the air, leaving an unspoken tension between them. "Rest well, then," Eliza said, standing and turning toward the fire. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life, her family's survival, was somehow intertwined with this stranger's presence. And the brine barrel, for all its promise, might hold more than just meat. It might hold the answers she needed, whether she was ready to face them or not. The storm had not let up, its icy fingers gripping the land without mercy. But within the walls of the cabin, a strange calm had settled over Eliza and her unexpected guest. The fire continued to burn brightly, casting its warm glow across the room, but the tension between them lingered in the space like an unseen weight. Eliza glanced over at the man who had settled in the corner by the fire, his cloak draped over his shoulders. He hadn't spoken much since their meal, only nodding in acknowledgement when she had shown him to a place to sleep. Now he was staring into the flames, his face unreadable. The children had fallen asleep, exhausted from the long day. They slept soundly in their makeshift beds, oblivious to the stranger in the corner of the room. Eliza felt a pang of protectiveness as she watched them. The world outside could be a brutal, unforgiving place, but inside her cabin she would do whatever it took to keep them safe. For now, safety was a fragile thing. As the fire crackled and the storm howled, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The stranger had left something unspoken between them, a mystery wrapped in a strange, brooding silence. Her instincts told her to trust him, but there was always that nagging fear that she had no idea who he truly was. "What's your name?" Eliza asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. It wasn't an attempt to be intrusive, but rather a simple curiosity. She needed to know more about the person she had let into her home, however temporary his stay might be. The man's gaze shifted toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he hadn't expected the question. For a moment he said nothing, his silence thick and heavy. Then, with a soft sigh, he spoke. "Isaiah," he said simply. "Isaiah Wallace." The name didn't ring any bells for Eliza, but she didn't press him for more details. It wasn't important. What mattered was that he had come to her door in need, and she had offered shelter. That was enough for now. Isaiah seemed to relax a little after the exchange, his shoulders sinking into the chair. But there was something in his posture that still seemed guarded, a wariness that didn't match his quiet demeanor. Eliza couldn't help but wonder about the weight of his past, the secrets he was hiding behind that calm exterior. As the evening drew on, the storm began to intensify. The wind outside whipped against the walls of the cabin, sending snow swirling against the windows. It was the kind of storm that made Eliza feel small, as though nature itself had the power to crush her and everything she held dear. She stood up from her seat, her eyes moving to the brine barrel in the corner of the room. She had been careful, meticulous with it. She could feel its importance growing with each passing day. The barrel was more than just a vessel for preserved meat. It had become a symbol of the delicate balance between survival and despair. Eliza turned toward Isaiah, who was still staring into the fire. "You should get some rest," she said, her voice softer now. "We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Isaiah didn't respond immediately, but after a beat he nodded. "You're right," he muttered. "Thank you." With that, he settled back into his corner, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. Eliza watched him for a moment, then moved to her children's bedside, tucking the covers in around them. As she returned to the fire, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the night pressing on her. There was something about Isaiah's presence that had unsettled her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The storm outside raged, but inside, the fire's glow was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. The morning came quietly, the heavy storm outside finally beginning to ease. The snow had fallen thick through the night, blanketing everything in a thick, white silence. Inside, the fire had burned low, leaving behind only the lingering warmth of a long night. Eliza had awoken early, her body stiff from the cold that crept through the cracks in the gowan. But the day had to begin, and she had no time to linger in bed. Her children were still asleep, the rhythmic rise and fall of their chests offering her the only peace she would get until the next time they rested. She stood up slowly, stretching her limbs, and moved to the fire, adding a few more logs to rekindle the warmth. The cabin was small, but every inch of it mattered. Every corner that protected her family from the elements was worth its weight in gold. The brine barrel, still tucked in the corner, seemed to glow in the early morning light. As she looked at it, Eliza felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. That barrel of salted pork had become their anchor, the only certainty they had left in this world. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Isaiah stirring from the corner. She turned to find him already rising from his seat, stretching his stiff limbs as he stepped toward the fire. "You sleep well?" Eliza asked, trying to break the lingering silence. Isaiah glanced at her, his face unreadable, but he nodded. "Not much to sleep through with that storm," he said, though his voice was low, more thoughtful than conversational. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Eliza continued, her voice steady, "about the land giving you more than you bargained for." Isaiah's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face, but it was gone before she could fully read it. "It's true," he said quietly. "Sometimes the land takes as much as it gives." Eliza paused, the weight of his words sinking in. She had known hardship, but she also knew that nature, in its cruel beauty, could be as merciless as it was generous. "Do you have family?" she asked, her curiosity pushing her to ask something personal. She had never been one to pry, but something about Isaiah's silence made her feel that perhaps he needed to speak, to let some part of his past out into the air. For a moment, Isaiah didn't respond. He looked down at the fire, his eyes lost in thought. "Not anymore," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lost them to fever a few winters ago." The admission hung in the air like a weight, and Eliza could feel the sadness in his voice. She didn't know what to say. Words often failed in moments like this, and she wasn't sure she could offer him the comfort he needed. Instead, she looked at the brine barrel again, her mind returning to the task at hand. "I've got enough to last a few more weeks," she said, her voice calm. "But it's not just food. It's a method, a way of holding on." Isaiah's gaze followed hers to the barrel. He was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe that's all we've got in the end, ways to hold on." Eliza's heart tightened. She hadn't expected him to understand, but somehow, in his own way, he did. The brine barrel wasn't just a way of keeping food, it was her way of keeping hope alive. She turned back to Isaiah, offering him a small, weary smile. "We'll get through this, together." Isaiah met her eyes, his expression softening, though he said nothing more. The storm had passed, but the promise of survival remained, carved not just in the food they preserved, but in the small, quiet moments that anchored them all. The days were beginning to blur together, one after the other, each colder than the last. The snow continued to fall, heavy and persistent, coating the world outside with a thick layer of white. The cabin, small as it was, felt safe, at least for now. But with every passing day, Eliza's sense of security grew more fragile. She spent her mornings tending to the fire and checking the brine barrel. The pork still looked good, the salt preserving it in a way she hadn't expected. And though it wasn't much, it was all they had. Each time she lifted the cloth and checked its contents, she felt a flicker of hope, but also a deep sense of responsibility. She couldn't afford to let any of it go to waste. The storm had stopped, but the air remained biting, and food was still hard to come by. Eliza had gone hunting once more, but her traps had yielded nothing. The wildlife had either retreated or was hidden deeper in the forest. Every trip into the woods felt more desperate, but there was no choice but to keep trying. Isaiah, meanwhile, kept to himself most days. He spent his time by the fire, silently, watching the snow fall, but occasionally he would offer to help with chores, chopping wood, reinforcing the cabin's walls, or checking for weak spots. Eliza didn't ask much of him, but she noticed his quiet determination. There was something about the way he worked, his focus, his quiet intensity, that made her wonder what else he might be hiding. Late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cold crept back in, Eliza found herself sitting by the fire, thinking of the future. How much longer could they survive like this? The brine barrel, though essential, couldn't last forever, and without more food, they would eventually run out of options. Her children were still healthy, but even their resilience had its limits. They could only go so long without the nutrition they needed. Eliza, Isaiah's voice broke through her thoughts. He had been sitting quietly in the corner, his gaze fixed on the fire. I think it's time we make a plan. We can't keep hoping for luck. She looked at him, unsure of what he meant, but in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own worry. Maybe he was right. Hope could only go so far. The next morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered horizon, the weight of the decision Eliza had been avoiding finally pressed down on her. Isaiah's words from the night before echoed in her mind. We can't keep hoping for luck. She couldn't afford to wait for something to change. The storm was over, but the cold had settled in for the long haul, and her family couldn't live on the scraps left in the brine barrel much longer. Eliza gathered what little she had, some dried herbs, a few remnants of deer meat, and the last of the preserved vegetables from the jars. She checked the brine barrel again, the sight of the salted pork still holding strong, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to see them through. She had to act. Turning to Isaiah, who was once again tending to the fire, Eliza spoke. I'm going back out into the woods today. I need to find more game, something, anything. I can't wait any longer. Isaiah didn't look up from the fire, but he nodded silently. It wasn't a question of if she should go, it was a matter of when. I'll go with you, he said, his voice steady, though his gaze remained fixed on the flames. Eliza hesitated. She knew that bringing Isaiah meant taking a risk, but in truth, she had no idea what else to do. His quiet support had been a comfort, but today would be different. It would be the first time she would have to leave the cabin and venture further into the wilderness, and she needed someone by her side. All right, she said finally, but we go prepared. We need to bring everything we have. Isaiah stood up, dusting off his coat. We'll make it work. We'll find something. With that, they gathered what little they could, checked their rifles, and prepared for the unknown. The brine barrel, though crucial, could only offer them so much. It was time to take the next step. The wilderness was unforgiving, but they had to face it head-on, or risk losing everything they had fought for. As they stepped out into the cold, the weight of the decision settled heavily on Eliza's shoulders. There was no turning back now.